So again, welcome to the Big Love Festival, celebrating nearly 40 years of universal education activities. And this session has been organized by the FDCW to celebrate and to share these universal education programs so that we all can develop our compassion and our wisdom and use it throughout the world. So this is the second day of the festival and the second session of the day. We will be translating in Portuguese and also in Spanish. So please look for your interpreter and you can connect there. So my name is Sharon Babineau and I come to you from Toronto, Canada, where there's a little bit of snow, but lots of sunshine. And I'm a universal education facilitator with the 16 guidelines. And it's my honor today to introduce our guest speaker for the day, which is Craig Mackie. And he will speak about 40 minutes and on universal education and the pedagogy and the 16 guidelines. And there will be a chance at the end for questions. So if you could write your questions in the chat, I will be monitoring the chat. So Craig Mackie, he is a social worker who has been using transformative mindfulness and the 16 guidelines in his clinical work for well over a decade. And he has brought the 16 guidelines to dozens of organizations and has reached and benefited thousands of people through these programs. I've met Craig over a decade. I think, Craig, it's probably gone back to 2008 when we first had the good fortune of living in the same community as Dekili Oldershaw, who is with us and the co-author of the book, The 16 Guidelines for Life. And Dekili had prototyped and trained facilitators for the 16 guidelines prior to it being adopted globally. So, Craig, I'm giving you the stage now as you share about universal education.
Thank you, Sharon, and certainly an acknowledgement to everyone joining us. And I see many of my teachers and friends. I want to just offer some motivation and intention for this hour that we have together. May we meet with open hearts and clear minds. May what we share today be beneficial to you and to all beings. And I'd like to also acknowledge the land that I'm on, which is First Nations land, the Odawa people, the Algonquin people, the Anishinaabe, and the people of Kitigan-Zibi. And I live close to the conjunction of two great rivers, the Ottawa River and the Gatineau River. And the Ottawa River gathers water from actually all the way from Western Canada and flows all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And the Gatineau River gathers water from the north, all the way from the Arctic. So there's a lot of connectivity even in this place that I am. And I offer that acknowledgement because I know that there is a place of privilege from which I speak to be here as a settler person, as a white person, as a person of education, and as a person who is financially stable and has a good income right now. So I have a lot of privilege, and I also have a lot of responsibility to speak from my heart and to speak with honesty about some of the programs and practices that have benefited me and others for the last over a decade. And so as you're sitting here, just in your own way, please set your own motivation for being here and acknowledge a good intention as you open to some new ideas, and hopefully also affirm and integrate what is being shared with what you already know. So this is a practice of mindful listening, of listening for resonance and integrating some of these ideas. So yeah, pedagogy, that's a big, boring word to talk about, how we teach what we teach, or how we facilitate what we facilitate. And I guess over the past, dozen or so years, the question of like how to teach and how to facilitate has really been more a question of how to embody. So I want to sort of reframe what we're talking about, and to touch in a few ways on what's needed to embody a facilitator or a teacher position within universal education. And certainly using the 16 guidelines as one of those programs. So the first sort of theme is around embodiment. I'm going to talk about some of the experiences that I've had in different organizations and sitting with different folks, from teens who have struggled with abuse and addictions and substance use, to lawyers who have one of the worst health outcomes for a profession worldwide. We don't often think of lawyers as being a marginalized population. To folks who are actually now trying to become teachers and facilitators of mindfulness practices, a wide range of mindfulness practices at the U of T. And also I'd like to bring in some aspects of my clinical work, which is primarily focused on working with folks who've experienced intergenerational and cultural trauma. So having worked with a lot of Indigenous folks and organizations, that's my daily work right now. And really to share how the 16 guidelines and the principles of universal education have informed that work and have hopefully benefited the folks who have experienced it. So the University of Toronto is the U of T, just as a quick clarification there. So I'm also trained in transformative mindfulness. So the second transformative mindfulness methods, and there's another talk by a lovely colleague of ours, Hillary, tomorrow. But having been trained in transformative mindfulness gives me sort of the second major topic that I'd like to introduce, and that is, what is transformation, and how do we create a space, create the conditions and the causes for great transformation and really healing to take place for individuals in our programs, and then rippling out from there to societies, to cultures, to groups, to families. So I'm going to introduce the idea and the process of transformation. And the last topic that I'd like to talk about is how to be with. How to be with resilience and strength, and how to be with suffering, how to be with personal suffering, collective suffering, how to be with personal healing and collective and cultural trauma, which is something we're facing right now globally on a few different fronts. So this is very practical stuff, right? This is greatly needed, and we've already heard some amazing examples of folks who are taking the 16 guidelines and other universal education programs will be talked about as well, to meet suffering, to answer a question that's being asked of us right now, which is how can we live a good life? How can we be well? And how can we reduce the causes of suffering? So that's actually in reverse order. I'm going to talk about being with in the context of how universal education has framed, for me, the ability and desire to be with, to be with change, to be with transformation, and to show up in places of suffering, with the motivation to change that. So I started to reflect on just the idea of universal education and how audacious it is. How can anything be universal other than whatever existence we're in? And having studied developmental psychology and phenomenology from in the philosophical traditions, there's a real tension around universality. What is universal? And of course, in psychology, the nature versus nurture debate. And so I started to reflect on sort of the genesis of universal education and actually where the 16 guidelines and 16 human dharmas come from to help answer this question, which is allowing me to be with whatever arises in individuals and groups. And it's, of course, the story, and I'm not going to tell the full genesis or story of the 16 guidelines. It's well told elsewhere, including in the book. But the 16 guidelines come from a place of change. They come from King Songtsen Gampo seeing suffering in a region of the world, the Tibetan Plateau, and asking for how to generate secular, non-faith-based, essentially universal principles to guide and to change and transform a society from a warring culture into one that's infused with kindness and peace. So this is the historical context, but then we have the modern or present day context of folks leaving the Tibetan plateau and these great lamas and great teachers and these people coming across and bringing their culture with them intact, bringing their teachers and their teachings with them intact. So, and then being asked by folks from the West to articulate, to say, like, you know, how are you so peaceful? How are you? And I don't mean to romanticize that suffering that they went through to get to those places of teaching, but it, from my understanding, it was quite quick. It was almost instantaneous to say, well, this is what we know and how to be, and this is what we can offer as a model of transformation that will keep our culture intact and help to heal the culture and the people that are coming through from the West. So if we think of universal education as an articulation of how to heal a cultural trauma or a rift, if we think of universal education as a set of tools, of principles, a set of programs, and of experiential practices, if we think of essential education as a modern articulation of how to heal a cultural trauma, then we can start to see how the generation or the production of the ideas and principles that guide universal education are universal, because they come from a set of suffering. They start actually with suffering. And they answer as an antidote, in a sense. If you suffer in this way, practice this. Right? If your culture is fractured in this way, practice this. Think about and frame how you see the fractures in your culture, in your society, in these ways, and then generate your own approaches, your own principles, embody your own practices. But think about the fractures in society in this way. So it's a framework, it's a bunch of tools, it's a bunch of practices. And it certainly comes at a very important time in the history of the world, where we are so intimately connected, more so, of course, than ever, through climate and through technology. The problem is with the 16 guidelines, and Allison has alluded to this many times in going through the iteration or the revision of the 16 human dharmas, is that when you take an intact indigenous knowledge set and you remove it from the context in which it was generated, you have a problem, which is the context has changed. And so the way that it's presented is changed, has to change as well in order to make it accessible. So if you're teaching, if you're teaching rules, you can teach those to children, right? You can teach them verbally, you can teach them through your actions and through your embodiment, because they're forming their way of being in the world. But if you're teaching rules to a society or a culture that has been decimated or fractured in both deep and subtle ways, then coming in with a new rule is actually is going to be very difficult. So we have to, or we have had to, and through the amazing production and how to present this stuff in a universal way, we have to, through the 16 guidelines at least, we've had to learn to present them not as rules, but as possibilities, as answers to questions of how you're suffering in this moment. And in that way, people are actually able to open up to them. And in fact, we aren't, we avoid the problems of cultural appropriation, which would say, I'm taking a value or an idea or a thought from this culture, I'm just placing it on top of this culture, I'm forcing it to be, etc. So this sort of gives the frame or the context of how universal education can be universal. And incidentally, it used to be called essential education. It's gone through many different names, right, to try and capture what, how do we talk about this stuff as a framework, as practices, as tools. It was called Essential Education, and I actually named my company Essential Change. And then Universal Education came along and they changed the name. So I was going, oh no, they changed the name, but I like the idea of essential. And this really speaks to the tools that can be integrated into each individual are, we're taking skills of mindfulness, we're taking skills of reflection and self-awareness, and we're integrating them in such a way that we are building essential blocks in order for transformation to happen. And so the essentialness or the essence of it is actually that we are presenting skills in such a way that are opening up questions for people, and they are answering those questions by going through a process of uncovering in the container and the frame that we're using. So there's a few assumptions that help guide this work. The one is that people are fundamentally good. One is that we have the capacity to have a good heart, and that we're actually born with a good heart, even though there may be layers of pain and suffering that occur even before birth. That good heart is there. And we have the capacity for clear minds. And we can remove the barriers to practicing or embracing a clear mind, or to using a clear mind. So the scaffolding or the sort of skills that we are presenting within universal education are, how do I enable people to acknowledge and come into contact with their good hearts. And that might be through a process of removing onions, layers of suffering, layers of messaging, layers of behaviors, layers of relationships. And how can we train people to clarify their minds, to create the conditions for stable minds? And I'm not talking about mind as in brain. I really think of the mind as the system of energy, the flow of energy inside and around us that is communicating with ourselves and others constantly. So how can we see those and come in contact with a clear mind and a good heart so that we can be happy? So the natural result is happiness. But also the other sort of deeper natural result is that we actually help others. And by embodying a good heart and a clear mind, it's a natural outcome. It's a natural outcome that can be greatly strengthened by a good motivation. So motivation is talked about within the UE teaching practice, and of course in many other traditions as well, as being fundamental and very, very important, motivation and intention. So if the motivation, so this is actually the second, or I guess third assumption of UE, and that is that it's a bit of a chicken and egg, cart and horse. Doing this work with the motivation to help others and benefit others is core. And either that motivation arises naturally through the practices and programs, or we start with it. And often when people come into a mindfulness program or something else, their motivation is to address their own suffering. But when we start to look at the interconnectivity of suffering, that motivation quickly transforms or becomes wider and broader, so that the motivation ripples out. So that's my attempt at being with, and being with suffering, being with good qualities, being with inner values that are at the heart of universal education and the 16 guidelines. I haven't even talked about a description of the 16 guidelines and what they are. So perhaps you want to pause here if you're not familiar and go on to 16guidelines.org or go through the FDCW website and check it out a little bit more. But I'm hoping that most people are familiar with that program, and because we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Being with. So let me get to embodiment in a second, because if I'm able to be with the universality or the essence of human change and learning, if I'm able to be with the universality of the human condition, I'm able to be with suffering, and I'm able to be with strength and resilience. But in order to do that and to get there, I might need to practice. I might need to practice a lot of different things and tools. And the 16 guidelines is specifically one of those very useful tools. So the 16 guidelines is basically a set of values, of inner values, of words. And I'm just going to share the screen really quickly. And again, I'm assuming that many of you are familiar with this. But here they are, if you aren't familiar with them. And just as a side note, don't necessarily pay attention to the people. They're pretty much all flawed. So focus on the words, and that's okay. We all have the shadow side, including everyone up here, including, yeah, everyone here in this group. But basically, these guidelines are broken up into 4 different wisdom themes. And you've heard other people allude to them and talk about them. And basically they're a way to structure peeling away the layers of how to be a good person. You know, in the University of Toronto course, I'm going to talk a little bit more about it at the end, but in which we're teaching the embodied qualities of mindfulness, we phrase them as questions. So if we're going to be mindful in a good way, because people are training to be mindfulness facilitators, if we're going to be mindful in a good way, best we pay attention to how we think. If we're going to be mindful in a good way, best we pay attention to how we act, how we relate to others, how we find meaning. And so what people do with that and where they go with that is up to them, right? It's up to them in terms of their journey, in terms of their teachers, in terms of their own motivations and practices. But these sort of four realms or four areas of inquiry are how the 16 guidelines have been framed. And I know they weren't originally framed like that in the root texts, but it really gives a useful container. So if we're going to facilitate, we need containers and frameworks to shape how we want people to, or what we want people to consider and reflect on. So even just asking those questions of how we think, how we act, how we relate to others, and how we find meaning is an essential way to frame a conversation that is at the heart of it a moral and ethical conversation. Which I think is incredibly important to talk about in the context of mindfulness or any change work that we're doing. Okay. So let me talk about, as we go through these 16 guidelines, I have to talk a little bit just about, you know, some process things, and that is the you know, if you didn't get a chance to listen to it this morning, Dekuli's description of facilitation is pure gold. So I would suggest going to Allison's panel and going to the video that she talked about. But it's basically, how do I create the conditions for sharing to happen in a group or in an individual, such that someone has an experience that challenges them, that creates a growth opportunity, that allows for them to experience something familiar and new at the same time. And then I ask the question, what do you know? Based on this experience, what do you know? And in fact, the second, or the sort of last step, which I would sort of add to that, is based on what you know, how do you apply that to your life? So the sort of fourth thing is to apply that and to get that feedback loop, which often happens immediately once you have an experience that is new or novel, and you have an insight, and then you go, wow, this is what I know, or an affirmation. So then it's the application process. How do you apply that? And by asking that last question, how do I apply that and bring that back to my life? We're actually getting people to magnify whatever new wiring has been established in that experiential process. Okay. So, you know, in the level 3 training for the 16 guidelines, we talk about encounter, explore, and experience. Encounter, explore, experience as the sort of the three, and I add sort of the fourth one, which is an overarching inquiry process, or a process of discovery, which is essential to an uncovering process. Okay, wow, I have 15 minutes left. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about embodiment. Actually, let me tie up transformation there. So what do I mean by transformation? There's sort of two important ingredients to transformation. One is the process of taking apart something that already exists. So if we're talking about some form of suffering, we're going, where's the suffering and what's the root cause? And we're actually walking with it. We're sitting with it. We're asking it to show itself. And Lama Zopa yesterday in his talk talked about working with the inner enemy so that the outer enemy disappears. And so this is, this line from his talk really spoke to me. And if there's a theme here, one of them is being with suffering is going to enable great change in a good way. So if we're walking with and we're encountering a form of inner suffering, or typically we start from a symptom, and we're saying, okay, well, I'm suffering in this way. I have pain here, I have depression here, I have anxiety there, I have another condition here. And we start to peel away the layers, and we actually walk with it. We sit with it in a kind, compassionate way, as if it's a wounded child or a hurt animal. And we cultivate an open heart. And then we go into, okay, now that I'm, and so this would be using things like mindfulness skills. Okay, so we have a skill of cultivating attention, awareness, maybe infusing some kindness in there. And we get to a meta skill, which is asking the root cause of suffering to show itself. If I'm able then to bring in something novel or something new, or have a creative moment or a moment of open curiosity, then I'm able to reframe that suffering and integrate it in a new way. So again, I'm not going to get too much more into that, but because there's another speaker, Hillary's going to talk about it tomorrow. But that's fundamental to the change process in all of universal education, is to look at any experiential, any teaching model to give people the skills and let's call them, their skills to become aware of something that they wish to change, which often shows up as something unpleasant. And then using a series of skills to then combine something new, which is a meta skill of taking a bunch of pieces of awareness and integrating in a new way. And then you have something that's transformed. Incidentally, when I get good at that and I transform suffering and I can actually develop my own inner awareness, I develop intuition. And intuition is just sort of the ability to trust the inner awareness that happens when I know something needs to transform or something has transformed. So we do this practice, just an example, we do this practice a lot in reframing. So in the 16 guidelines, we take a situation where there's a conflict or some sort of challenge, and then we check what we know, what we feel, and then we bring in a guideline and we say, how would this guideline change the situation? So that's sort of a perfect, and then we sit with the guideline, what we know about the guideline, etc. So this is a perfect sort of illustrator of a change that would be transformational. I think the things that really heighten that or deepen that ability to transform are a solid set of skills. So practicing various mindfulness skills, various therapeutic skills of being aware. I certainly, from my own training in the transformative mindfulness models methods, we teach people to feel and to get into the body first. And I know that's a large part of a lot of mindfulness practices too, in order to integrate what they know inside. So we can do that with values as well, with the 16 guidelines. Okay. So the question of how do we actually do that from a facilitator standpoint? I want to talk a little bit about embodiment and sort of finish on the last theme of embodiment. And what does it mean to embody the role of the facilitator or the person who's holding space? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the practices that have helped me to do that over the years. So if we have sort of, let's just recap for a second, this, theoretical being with, how, asking ourselves a question of how can I be with suffering or just acknowledge it? And then, bringing in any universal education tool, but specifically the 16 guidelines to say, okay, now that I'm aware of this suffering, I have these things, I have these tools that might help me alleviate or transform how I relate to the suffering. And they also might be direct antidotes to the suffering that I'm experiencing in my life or in the world. We then have to ask, okay, so how do I as a facilitator help other people do that? And my sort of the most important quality is the embodiment of the facilitator. And let me break that down for you a little bit. So embodiment, we teach in this, let me just bring up a slide to sort of give you a the academic response to that question. So I'm going to share a screen, and this this tool is something that we use at the University of Toronto in the Applied Mindfulness Meditation Certificate Program. And it's something that we call the Mindful Moral Compass, my moral compass. And in this program, we get folks to go through the 16 guidelines, and we introduce them to, the 4 wisdom themes. And we ask them sort of to articulate 4 areas that are important to consider when you wish to embody the role of the facilitator. And the first area is the top left quadrant, which is identifying your motivation and intention. And so in some ways, what the motivation and intention is important, but the skill is the ability to identify motivation and intention. So we're teaching people to be aware, because that motivation and intention will probably change over time as people change. The second quadrant is to help them identify their own inner values. And we use the 16 guidelines to certainly explore that, but also to get people to identify, where do my values come from? What values did I grow up with that don't align with me anymore? Where are my professional and my community and my family values coming from? And can I articulate those? Which is, again, the skill is, the values are important, of course, but it's the ability to identify those values, which becomes a meta skill that gets applied and refined over time. Practices involve things like, do I, just within the mindfulness field, we're using that as the context, but you can use, we've heard many examples of folks so far of taking their practices out into the world. So you have the formal on the cushion practice, and you have the practices out in the world, the activism, the working with groups, the working in your family, the applying the rituals, etc. And then finally, we have supports. Who supports you, whether that's teachers, past, present, or future, mentors, programs, knowledge sets, and things like that. So when we get folks to articulate these elements, then the question of embodiment isn't just like, how am I showing up, which is incredibly important. It's what's all the things that are underneath that, which are helping me to embody, the type of teacher or facilitation that I want to be. Okay. And the sort of assumption, again, or one of the main tenets of that program, or that role of the embodying qualities of mindfulness within the certificate program, is to help folks understand and to know or to consider that mindfulness, and sort of any facilitation, but in this context, mindfulness is a value-based practice. And it can be, and it should be. And so those are the components of that. So, and again, just to bring it back to the 16 guidelines, this is an incredibly important part of the 16 guidelines, which is obviously to say, what are my inner values? Which of these can help me navigate whatever I'm going through? So the last aspect of embodiment that I wanted to talk about are my practices and what helps me to sit in groups that I'm an outsider, or to sit with individuals that that I'm trying to help, and sort of trying to break it down into four things. One is to ground, the other is to connect, the third is to let go, and the fourth is to gather. So what does it mean to ground? For me, it means to be present in my body, to allow my sensations, emotions, and thoughts to guide me. It also means to accept where I am, who I am. And the image that I use that's been taught to me is a rooting practice, is using the visual of dropping down roots. The second element is to connect. And what I'm connecting to is actually incredibly important. First, I'm connecting to what I would call a universal space of wisdom, of energy, of love, compassion. And I use the image, and I use the qualities of my teachers. And so what I do is I ask, or I imagine my teachers to show up in a space above me. I am actually imagine them. I'm a visual person. I'm a visual learner. So I imagine them showing up, and their bodies and their good qualities. And I imagine those good qualities connecting down to me. And so when I connect, and you can do this in any way that fits for you, but the main principle is you're connecting to something that's greater than yourself and intimately connected to yourself. So actually there's no difference, which means there's an absolution, or that I'm absolving of the ego, which allows for the third element of embodiment to arise, which is the letting go process. And the letting go process is to allow people to explore whatever experience I've helped design, whether that's a group discussion, whether that's a game, whether that's an intellectual activity. I have created the experience, I've grounded and connected, and now all I have to do is let go and create a safe container for them. Okay? And so I need to be aware of different elements of safety, and that's another big talk. But I let go, and then the final step is to gather. So once we've gone through that process, or we've had an experience, we gather the internal wisdom, we gather the felt sense, and then we share. And sharing does two things. It helps inspire others, and it helps magnify or deepen the inner wisdom. And of course, there's elements of safety around sharing, that we have to respect limits and respect people's limits. So I haven't gotten into any discussions about the fun examples of places that I've taken this and things like that. But that's some of the key elements of why I think it is even possible to have universal education, because we're actually just being with some aspect of human experience that is universal. And we can go on the other side of suffering and say, well, joy, happiness, connection, love is also universal, and that's equally important. And the second piece around thinking about transformation and the ingredients necessary for transformation to take place, and that every interaction can be transformational. And then the third piece is around embodiment of connecting with one's own motivations, intentions, inner values, practices, and supports. And then having a practice that allows you to ground in your own way, to connect in your own way, to let go in your own way, and to gather in your own way. So those are the ingredients that have helped me. Yeah, I'd like to open it up to questions. And I could cover a few more things if folks want, but please open up to questions. Okay, so I actually see one in the chat from Victoria. Yeah, making people feel safe as a part of facilitation. So I'm hoping that the embodiment piece at the end that I shared answered a little bit about that. But if I could add something is to, I always start with humility whenever I'm entering a group, whenever I am trying to share something. So this is fundamentally a guiding, a guideline for me, because I sit with folks of different cultures, I sit with folks of different positions in life, and I think it starts with the assumption that they are the experts, that they have inner wisdom, that they already have the tools to heal themselves. So I'm not actually, so it really is a process of keeping my ego in check, or keeping my any assumptions other than those that I would have about them. Some assumptions good, some assumptions bad. But yeah, I assume that they are their best guides, and I'm just happen to be here as a helper person. The other piece, I mean, that because I work in the trauma world, and we get this question all the time at teaching at the University of Toronto. How do I protect people and work with people that that I don't know? Essentially, I don't know anything about them other than they're showing up and they want to take a group or a course or whatever with me. If I don't have their history, I have to articulate that they're allowed to set their own boundaries, that they're allowed to take what I am sharing as a suggestion. And so it is a trauma-informed approach, and I think there's a lot of great healing practices around that. And I know FDCW has done some work around that. So I don't know if that helps clarify that question, Victoria, if you wanted to expand on it at all.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, please share any other questions. How we think, how we act, how we relate, and how we find meaning. So those are the 4 wisdom themes of the 16 guidelines. I think that answers hopefully the question. And just as a side note or sidebar to that, I think the term "how we think" is well articulated to mean something more than just thoughts, because what goes on in our being actually shapes shapes our world. It's not just our thoughts. The facilitator as learner. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Marion. So this, yeah, so thank you. So I have somewhere in my scribbled notes that I learned. So I think of it actually as learner or co-healing. Co-healing. And I think of learning as healing. And so if I'm able to connect, actually, and thank you, this is actually a really important point that I missed. So when I'm connecting as the facilitator, I'm not just connecting to my greatest wisdom or the part of me that is, connected to my teachers. I'm bringing in the person I'm sitting with. I'm bringing in the people of the circle into that equation as well. And so I'm opening to their contributions as holding as much wisdom as I do, for sure, which means I'm creating a space of learning for myself. When you work from the heart, when you work from a place, when you're letting go of attachments to outcomes, when you're working with, the energy of connectivity, or, the quantum mind, then you actually co-heal. You learn as you teach. So I think when I'm talking about the embodied practices at the end of the talk there, I'm really talking about the conditions necessary to be a co-learner, because that just happens naturally. But that's a very important point. Thank you. Okay, translation from, I don't know if one of the translators is able to translate Carmen Martinez Orzo's question.
I can translate that. It says,
Thank you.
Yeah, so how could you explain how you use the meditation so that it has this transformative effect for transformation?
Tune in to the talk on transformative mindfulness tomorrow. That's the short answer. So just really quickly, and this is actually an important point too, is that, when I'm working with the 16 guidelines, or the model of meditation that I'm using, has the goal of transformation already embedded in it. All right, so that is sort of a first important precondition, not necessarily for transformation to take place, but for how I approach meditation. All right, so I'm working with meditation as building skills in order for transformation to take place. So I talked a little bit about the skills and the meta skill aspect of mindfulness. And, so I'll, give you a quick example in the 16 guidelines. Let's say we're talking about honesty, and I want, I'm feeling what honesty feels like. I'm replaying and I'm imagining a situation in my mind where I have felt the effects of honesty, where I felt the effects of dishonesty, and I'm generating an inner sense of what the feeling is in the body, and the emotional content and the psychological content. And if I'm able to use the mind, the stable, clear mind, to encounter the whole of what's going on, and I get out of just the idea of honesty, then I'm actually opening myself up to an integrative process. I'm starting to see all the pieces in place. And there may be other energetic pieces and other ways of knowing honesty that I'm not even tapping into, but I'm getting a more full picture. And so in a transformative practice, we would take those pieces, and then we would say, what would help bring them into a situation? The key step, again, we'll talk about this much more, is getting your own ego or attachment out of the way. And the simplest and quickest way to do that is to ask for help. So if I see a problem that I'm stuck at, or I'm stuck with, or I'm ruminating upon, and I see a solution, maybe I bring honesty in, and I feel that, and I have all this good feeling and insights, then all I have to do is ask for help to bring it in. Okay? If I can let go and ask for help in that sense, then transformation takes place. So I'm taking some old stuff, I'm breaking it down, and I'm taking some new stuff, and I'm developing a very deep way of being with it, and then I'm bringing it in a novel way, and poof, you have transformation. I'm curious where you studied. So I did a degree in developmental psychology in Alberta, and then a philosophy degree in Ottawa and Germany, and a social work degree in University of Toronto. I studied Buddhism. My introduction to Buddhism was through the Shambhala tradition, actually, and then moved over to FDCW and UE, and have sort of learned about Buddhism through the universal education, and have sort of filled in other important practices and concepts like that. So how do you adapt? Okay, in 2 minutes or less, how do you adapt the 16 guidelines or any UE program? I mentioned it first, but let me just drill down on it. If you're working with any group, there needs to be a core question or a core need that's being met. Okay, so we're not going to create change if if folks are not ready or wanting some sort of change. So within an organization, that might be the director, that might be the principal of the school, or that might be a colleague who's like, we're all suffering here. We need some tool to help that. But the asking or the request to bring the tool in is the first step. And so then designing a practice or a process that helps, and there's a bit of consultation here. You know, what are the challenges you're facing? How do you experience those? How are you articulating those, etc.? And then basically running it through the 4 wisdom themes for the 16 guidelines, because often we're being asked to solve a problem in a very short time, because people don't want to pay for the 10-week course. They want you to come in for an afternoon or a day or an hour. But if I have my own framework that I can see, okay, well, let's just work on how we're relating, you know, in the office, or let's work on how we think as a group. And then I do a bit of funneling, but it's basically a practice of what's the type of suffering that's coming in, and then can I funnel it through the 4 wisdom themes, and then if I take people through some practices and experiences, often, so that's just the design process, but often really all that's needed is a container for people to share and to talk about their inner values. And for me, that's the biggest letting go process, is when we've done a few things in groups, in schools, in organizations, you know, and training hundreds of volunteers and hundreds of staff at a time. When we've done a few things where people get to connect with themselves and then share that with somebody else, that's enough for the synergy and the magic of you know, group transformation to take place. Okay, so that's basically, you know, the design process in a small amount of time. That's a design process, and then the process. But again, it only works if me as a facilitator, if I come in thinking I know the solution to their problems, it's not going to work, right? So I have to come with the assumptions of universal education. I have to come with the assumptions that I talked about in order for them to help themselves. That's ultimately the goal, for them to help themselves. And that becomes a meta skill. And I leave, and then they're left with, oh, these are the things that I do to help myself. This is how I transform my own environment, my own inner suffering. Yeah, that's a very good question. So where is the healing source coming from in a group session? From the group, from the juices, you know. Again, it's just this analogy, or this container. Like all I'm doing is creating a container, a space for the healing juices to flow. There is some management of, you know, what I would call toxicity that can be added, you know, in et cetera, and there's group dynamics to manage. But ultimately, yeah, the healing juices come from the sharing, the interactivity, from what I just sort of articulated there, is people being able to, so me asking them to connect with their own inner values, by, or their own inner felt sense is a healing generating juice, right? That's a healing generated question. And I think what was shared, you know, from the talk this morning, the woman who was asking those kids from Sri Lanka, like, what's your aspiration? Just posing the question. And you know, I loved her description of, you know, these kids have been through incredible hardship and suffering, but she's able to ask them. That's empowering, right? That is healing. So you do that with individuals, you do that with groups, etc. What? So we could keep going for another 5 or 10 minutes. I'm happy to keep answering these questions. I'm aware of time, but maybe I'll just take 1 or 2 more. What if your audiences are not connected to their inner wisdom yet? Can healing still occur? Who is this? Mita Cheng. These are really good questions. Yes. And if they aren't connected, so I can use some clinical examples of people who have experienced so much trauma and intergenerational trauma and complex childhood trauma that they have no archetype or very few archetypes for love, safety, security, etc. Right. Who every person in their life has failed them, etc. So my assumption is that they still have human consciousness. They still have the capacity to develop awareness. They still have the capacity to cultivate a good heart and a clear mind. And if they're sitting there, then they have some motivation, right? If they're engaging in some way, they have some motivation. Now, whether they're sitting with me or opening up an app or opening up the book or doing a course online, they have some motivation. So I think it starts with that. It may be clouded, it may be full of suffering, and there's so many layers to the onion, etc., to work through. But yes, I think healing definitely can occur. I had a young fellow who basically I asked him to relate to a tree, you know, or to pick some object in nature that was the least threatening, and to learn and to use that as his way of relating to another living being. So he cultivated inner wisdom in that way. Yeah. So I think we, yeah, that's time. Unless somebody wants me to keep talking. Thank you all so much. Thank you for your questions and your attention. Somebody asked for my email, so let me just put a slide so it's also in the, yeah, let me just do this. So it's in the presentation online, so I'm going to share my email. So it's pretty easy, Craig@essentialchange.net. And that was the opening slide. There you go, everyone. I actually had a slideshow that I didn't use very much. And those are the three kind of themes of the talk. Yeah. So thank you. Feel free to be in touch. Yeah.
Thank you. That was amazing. And as you're talking about models of transformation and how to be with our suffering and to start with our own suffering, you reminded me that I actually found the 16 guidelines shortly after my daughter had passed away from cancer. And so I couldn't find the language or the tools anywhere. And this, really became my home for the last decade. And I'm so grateful for that. And I'm so grateful I've learned so much from you. over the years. And I've just sat here these last 45 minutes, probably as my eyes as big and my ears as open as everyone else here. And so thank you so much for that. So this is our time. I'd like to thank everyone from joining us all over the world. And it's a wonderful festival and expression of love and interconnectedness. And there will be more sessions tomorrow. I'll put in the chat the link if you feel like you would like to support our organization and pay this forward so that other people can also benefit. So thank you. Thank you very much.